A WZY-TV editorial analysis. Ridgeview Heights. When $166 million of public money meets a terminated housing project. The image attached raises a question that should concern every Trinidad and Tobago taxpayer, regardless of political affiliation. How does a housing project reach the point where $166 million has reportedly been spent, units remain unfinished, and the project is ultimately terminated? According to the graphic, Housing Minister Philip Alexander alleges that construction at Ridgeview Heights reached approximately $1.2 million per unit, while the estimated potential selling price was only $600,000 per unit. The minister reportedly described the situation as the worst of the worst. The graphic attributes the information to the Trinidad and Tobago Guardian, dated August 17, 2026. If those figures are accurate, this is not simply a story about unfinished houses. It is a story about the economics and accountability of public sector housing. The $1.2 million versus $600,000 problem. The most striking number in the graphic is the claimed disparity between the construction cost and potential selling price. If taxpayers effectively spend $1.2 million to produce a unit that can potentially be sold for $600,000, the project has an enormous structural financial problem. That represents a potential $600,000 gap per unit before considering financing, administrative expenses, infrastructure, maintenance, legal costs, or other project-related expenditures. And that leads to the central question: who approved the original financial model? A government housing program does not necessarily have to make a commercial profit. Affordable housing can legitimately involve subsidies because government has a social policy objective. But there is a huge difference between a deliberate housing subsidy and a project whose economics were fundamentally incapable of working. The public deserves to know which one Ridgeview Heights was. $166 million cannot simply become a statistic. The graphic says $166 million was spent on partially completed units before the project was terminated. That number should trigger more than political outrage. It should trigger an audit trail. Taxpayers should be able to determine: 1. How much was originally budgeted? 2. How much was actually spent? 3. What contracts were awarded? 4. Who were the contractors and subcontractors? 5. What were the original completion dates? 6. Were there cost overruns? 7. Why did construction costs reach the reported level? 8. How many units were actually constructed? 9. How much of the $166 million represents recoverable value? 10. What happens to the unfinished structures now? 11. Who bears responsibility for the project's failure? Those questions are more important than partisan finger-pointing. And then there is the human side. Housing policy is ultimately about people, not concrete. Every unfinished unit represents a family that potentially could have had a home. Every dollar spent inefficiently represents resources that could have been directed toward another housing development, infrastructure, schools, healthcare, or other public priorities. That is why failed public projects should not be treated merely as accounting exercises. There must be an assessment of opportunity cost. What could Trinidad and Tobago have accomplished with $166 million if the project had been properly designed, costed, and managed from the beginning? The political temptation. Here is where WZY-TV believes the debate must be disciplined. A government inheriting a troubled project has every right, and arguably an obligation, to expose the circumstances surrounding it. But exposing a problem is not the same as solving it. If the current administration is presenting Ridgeview Heights as an example of previous failures in public housing, then the next step must be transparency. Show the contracts. Show the expenditure. Show the approvals. Show the feasibility studies. Show the projected cost per unit. Show why the numbers changed. And show taxpayers exactly where the $166 million went. That is how political accountability becomes public accountability. The bigger lesson: Ridgeview Heights should not simply become another political weapon thrown across the parliamentary aisle. It should become a case study in how government projects should and should not be managed. Before a major housing development begins, government should establish independent benchmarks for Cost per unit, construction timeline, projected selling price, subsidy required, financing structure, completion risk, exit strategy. And those benchmarks should be publicly available. Because once hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars are committed, the public should not have to wait until buildings are abandoned or projects are terminated to discover that the numbers never made sense. WZYE-TV's bottom line. The image is deliberately provocative, but beneath the political messaging is a legitimate public interest question. If the reported numbers are correct, how did a housing project reach a point where the construction cost was reportedly twice the potential selling price? That question deserves a serious answer. Not PNM versus UNC. Not government versus opposition. Not political spin. Taxpayer versus the system. Because $166 million is not political money. It is the people's money. And when that kind of money is spent on a project that ultimately fails, the public deserves three things: transparency, accountability, and consequences where warranted. WZYE-TV, Caribbean News. No filter, no fear.